My name is Dr. Charles Larkin. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Policy Research, and we are holding this special seminar on what MPs think about AI in conjunction with the Department of Computer Science at the University of Bath. The Department of Computer Science at the University of Bath has an AI and machine learning research group, which is exploring the relationship between natural and artificial intelligence. Ourselves at the Institute for Policy Research have a very successful policy fellowship program in artificial intelligence, which has run for several years. And for those of you that are interested in knowing more about that, please contact Andy Dunn at the University of Bath's IPR. So with us today, we have James Boyd-Wallis. James is the co-founder of the Appraise Network for AI Policy and Communications Professionals. He set up the nonprofit network in February of 2023 in response to growing policymaker and media interest in artificial intelligence. James is also the managing director of a boutique public affairs and reputation management consultancy known as Highbury Communications. And he's the vice chair of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations and Public Affairs Group. He has worked in communications, public affairs, and policy circles for nearly 20 years. And today he will be giving us a presentation on the first round of the Appraise Network's research on AI, on what MPs think about AI. And please come ready with questions because there's a questions and answers session at the end, which will inform the second round of their research. So without further ado, I hand you over to James.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that introduction, and very nice to be here this afternoon. And as Charles mentioned, any questions, please do feel free to fire them over, and you can ask them as we go through or at the end. I'm sort of easy either way. I will just share my screen so we can get the presentation up. Hopefully that's now working for everyone.
Yes,
it's great stuff.
clear.
Cool. So we'll crack on with the research then. So just very quickly before we do that, Charles, I think you sort of mentioned a bit about Appraise, but I'll just recap very quickly. So we're a network we launched spring last year for AI policy and comms professionals. I co-founded it with someone else called Aidan Muller. Our sort of backgrounds are a little bit different, but complementary. So my sort of experience is mainly focused on corporate communications and public affairs, mainly working for technology businesses and primarily enterprise technology businesses. So sort of throughout the last decade and a bit more, I've sort of seen the sort of development of an interest in AI through that prism, and I've seen sort of how it's become more important for those businesses. If you'd asked some of them 10 years ago what they were doing around AI, they may have said they use a bit of machine learning for a particular product or feature within their portfolio. Now those businesses are AI-driven, AI-powered, whatever terminology that they might want to use. Aidan's experience is a little bit different. So he comes at it more from a sort of social media and digital public affairs background. He's worked predominantly with sort of think tanks, policy institutes, and the sort of policy environment. So he's very concerned about the sort of broader information environment in which we find ourselves and how AI can impact both information, disinformation, and sort of start to erode and continue the erosion of that trust that we see in expertise and experts. So we have a slightly different viewpoint and slightly different experience. Where we come together is largely in response to what we sort of saw, following the launch of ChatGPT and the sort of media hype and policymaker hype as well around AI and its implications. And you saw effectively on one side there was huge amount of promise and hype, as I've mentioned. On the side there was a lot of sort of doomsaying and doom mongering. And what seemed to be missing is that bit in the middle, which was actually what does the evidence say? What does it show us? Where are we at the moment in terms of some of these issues and debates, and therefore what should the public and policymaker response be? So We formed Appraise to try and bring people together across that community. We don't represent anyone in particular. We don't take funding from anyone in particular. So we're self-funded at the moment. That's quite important for us because we don't want to be seen as lobbying for big tech or for startups or for institutes or for third sector. We want to try and represent everyone. So that's just a bit of context before we get into it. So moving on then to actually that's just a little bit about some of our members. So you can see some of the members that we have individuals from. So anyone from the Alan Turing Institute, which I'm sure everyone will know, right through to AI startups like Holistic AI. So coming on to the research then, just a bit of context about the research itself. So we researched 108 MPs through online interviews. It was conducted by YouGov, so a responsible research agency. It's representative of the makeup of the current Parliament. So a majority of responses come from Conservative MPs, slightly fewer from Labour MPs, and then quite a lot less from the other parties, which is why, as you'll see as we go through this, we only really break down responses according to the two main parties. And the field work, this was carried out between the 3rd and 31st of May. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, you'll probably all remember, but in the middle of that period, we had Sam Altman presenting to the US Congress about his views and opinions on AI and its regulation. That's likely to have impacted what MPs and others were thinking and feeling about AI at the time. And the other important consideration for us is that obviously it's just a snapshot at the time. We appreciate that things would have changed since this time, especially given there's been a bit more focus on it from a policymaker point of view since the AI white paper last March. The other thing to say about the survey, just in terms of caveats, is that obviously an online survey with small numbers, it has its drawbacks as research. It's therefore not intended to inform any academic research in that sense, but merely to provide a snapshot for discussions with people in the community. So in terms of the research itself, we felt there were sort of three main key insights that we took from it. So the first was that MPs don't feel regulators are appropriately equipped to regulate AI. We'll come on to the importance of that in a minute. Two, concerns around AI vary quite significantly, and that many MPs are undecided. And again, we feel that undecided point is important, which we'll come on to a bit later. And at number three, MPs would prefer, on the whole, a slower rollout of AI. And again, that third one's probably quite important to remember that context we just talked about. This was, in May, it's when loads of hype and doom-mongering around this technology was happening. I expect things have changed now, but we will be looking to conduct a follow-up piece of research in another couple of months. And as Charles mentioned, if anyone's got any views on that and what should be included, we'd really love to hear it as part of today's session. So just before we get into the first insight, just a quick bit of context, which we feel is important and which probably many people on this call will be familiar with or aware of. AI, from a policymaker point of view, it's not new. Back in 2018, we had the industrial strategy and the AI sector deal. Much of the sentiment from that was carried through into the AI white paper. We saw similarities around how they talked about the principles that AI should follow. It isn't that AI white paper in March wasn't the first time that the government looked at this. There's also been other reports and investigations by the Commons, by the Lords, by different committees, by the APBG for AI as well. So again, this is an issue that MPs have considered before. It's an issue that policymakers do know about. It hasn't just appeared on their agenda in the last few months, despite what the impression we might get from the media narrative that surrounds it. Obviously, since March, there's been a few updates as well. So the AI Safety Summit in November And then at the moment, the government is obviously considering the consultation responses to that AI white paper that launched in March last year, which we expect anytime now. So we do expect to see some evolution of the government's response, but probably not too much evolution. The AI minister has already said that it's not going to bring, this government isn't going to bring any legislation forward. So just looking at that first insight then, MPs do not feel the UK is sufficiently equipped to regulate AI. So we found in the research that just 6% of MPs believe existing regulators have the skills or expertise to regulate AI. So an overwhelming 69% said they didn't. And quite a big proportion, 25%, said neither or don't know. That's obviously relatively important for the current government because its white paper put an emphasis on existing regulators to regulate AI within their sectors. And indeed, some of those regulators, Ofcom, the ISE, has already looked at AI. It's already considering the impact of AI in its sector. It's those regulators are quite well advanced. They do have resources. They do have expertise. However, there are other regulators which haven't thought about this at all. So the Health and Safety Executive, for instance, there's not much in terms of thought so far from them. And also, we know that regulators are under resource constraints. Some of them don't have the funding to do what they need to do already under their current remit. So if we layer AI on top, what's that going to do? So there's clear concerns amongst MPs on that. Interestingly, that was shared pretty equally amongst Conservatives and Labour. So 6% Labour, 7% Conservatives. It's, again, for us, a little bit surprising in a way, given that the government's white paper, Conservative government, put forward this proposal, and yet only 7% of their own MPs agree that that's effectively, at the moment, the right approach. That does sort of, to us, slightly raise the question of, how is this government trying to bring its own MPs along? How is it trying to ensure that it has its support in the House for its measures? And there's a bit of a question around that. In terms of the neither or don't knows, 34% Conservative don't know compared to 18% Labour. Probably not a huge margin given the small numbers that we're able to interview, so 108. But nevertheless, a little bit of interest there, we think, around that larger don't know number. So overall, MPs tend to be a bit more optimistic about AI than pessimistic, but it's not a landslide. So 44% agree they're more optimistic than pessimistic compared to 27% disagree. However, and as we mentioned on the previous slide, and as you'll see as we go through this research, there is quite a big number of people, number of MPs who say neither or don't know. This, for us, I think is one of the sort of consistent insights of our research and actually of the presentations that we've done of our research. In that, despite the fact that AI has been around for a while, the policymaker response isn't new. We saw, that couple of slides ago, 2018, there was that sector white paper. It's interesting that still a number of MPs don't really know what they think about these issues yet. When we're feeding this back to one of the large AI institutes, the response from some of the public policy team was that was surprising, given they've done probably more than 100 briefings with different MPs on these issues over the years. So our MPs listening to those briefings was one of the concerns raised. In terms of optimism and pessimism, we can see that Tory MPs are slightly more optimistic than Labour MPs. We've got a bit of an understanding for why this is in a couple of slides, so we'll sort of dig into that more there. But I guess our sort of initial instinct was probably that this breaks down according to those sort of party lines where Labour MPs may be more concerned about jobs and the impact on workers, given the closer links to unions and the background of the Labour Party. And again, Conservatives may be seeing more of the benefits in terms of the potential productivity gains that AI could produce for the economy and for businesses more widely. That's a little bit superficial, but it does seem to be backed up to some extent by some of the questions that we've got later on as well, which we can dig into. And then in terms of MPs' understanding of the implications of AI, only 23% said they understand the implications. 43% said they didn't, and again, a big sort of proportion of people there, 34%, said they didn't know, or said neither. So again, for us, if you're an AI focused think tank or research institute or developer or deployer, that means there's probably a bit of work to do to increase understanding of what you do amongst MPs in order to make sure that your voice is heard and that your arguments are seen in the way that you want them to be seen. And again, that was split fairly evenly across party lines, so 21% Conservatives compared to 27% Labour. The neither don't knows fairly similar again, and disagrees fairly similar. So largely things tracking across party lines. And we also asked MPs whether they'd used ChatGPT or another tool. Only a third had, 51% hadn't, and 60% didn't know. Now, for us, this probably is a bit of an understanding question because no doubt an MP probably would have used some AI-enabled tool in some way, even if it's only Siri on their phone or Alexa or whatever it might be in their home. They probably just don't know it. They probably haven't realized. They're probably not aware that it's using AI in some format. And we think it also slightly is indicative of the media narrative at the time, which is very, very heavily focused on Gen AI and the advances that we've seen with that, and not on the other types of AI, which we know have been embedded in software and technology for a lot longer. So that's the sort of first insight. I'll just pause there very briefly. If there are any questions on any of that, I can see actually one in the chat already.
Yes. There's one already in the chat, and it's looking at the impact on knowledge workers such as lawyers and executives who are non-unionized. Should former MPs looking for a job in the not too distant future actually be more concerned? I'll leave that to you to answer. You have the HR training.
I think that's a great question. I appreciate the sentiment. To answer that, I'll give you a very slight tangential anecdote. So I was speaking to the CEO of a policy platform, policy and sort of public engagement platform a couple of weeks ago. Part of their platform is an offer for MPs to help them with their research, with their policy briefings, with their statements to the House, to others. Part of that tool is an AI-enabled platform. So MPs can go into it, they can answer or help use this AI platform to help answer the questions they may have, the research answers they need to get to. And I can't exactly remember the percentage that he gave me, but it's something ridiculous, like 70% of MPs have used their tool and have used the AI functions on their tool to help answer those questions. So I think, yes, I think MPs are very aware that AI is coming for the knowledge workers' jobs. I think probably a lot of them are thinking about their next steps as a result. But yeah, great question. So second insight then, concerns around AI vary, with many yet to make up their minds. So on employment, MPs tend towards more jobs being lost than created as a result of AI. So 42% compared to 25%. Again, a huge number, 33%, neither or don't know. Just before we sort of kicked off the presentation, we were just discussing some of the latest research on this. We've seen that the IMF said that 40% of jobs are going to be impacted by AI. There have been other studies to show that actually perhaps some of that impact won't be as quickly felt as what we might think from MIT because of the costs of implementing AI. That's obviously going to change as the costs go down. And also the different types of workers that may be affected. So as the questioner pointed out just there, it's going to be primarily focused on probably knowledge workers, those white collar workers, professional workers, where who haven't seen such disruption before. So you can see where the concern comes from. I mean, I guess my take on this, especially speaking to other policymakers or sort of AI experts in this space, is that I think the overall feeling is that there's a difference at the moment between exposure and adoption. We've seen quite a lot of exposure to AI, but actually how many businesses are truly adopting it at this point in time? I think that's a question that's still up for debate. I know someone from McKinsey who I was speaking to recently, who runs their research team, said that I think it was 15% of firms have actually truly adopted AI at the moment. So still a relatively small number. So how many jobs are we going to see affected at this point? Probably not too many. But obviously it's starting to happen. We had some news reports probably a few months ago now, I think, of BT making some of their call center workers redundant and replacing them with AI chatbots and tools. We're definitely going to see more of that, I think, as we go through the years. So in terms of the sort of job loss concerns, 24% of Labour, 24% of Conservative MPs are concerned compared to 64% Labour. That's probably obvious why, as we mentioned earlier on, but also supports that stat earlier on as well around the Conservatives perhaps being slightly more optimistic about AI and therefore looking at the potential productivity boost that we might see. Labour being slightly less optimistic and therefore more worried about the impact on jobs, probably largely related to what we talked about. And actually, we delivered this research to someone who used to be in Labour's policy team, technology policy team. His view on this was similar to ours, and that at the moment there probably is a concern amongst the Labour front bench and Labour team that there is a need to look after working people. We can see that obviously with Labour's approach to many things at the moment, and they think that this approach will follow through into its technology policy as well. So in terms of the sort of benefits and costs of AI, many don't think it's going to be fairly distributed across society, so 63% compared to only 9%. That's probably not surprising given I think how we've seen AI develop at the moment, where we can see that the large players, big tech, are dominating both the products that have been released and also the conversations with policymakers. So around this time, as mentioned, we had Sam Altman going around the world, meeting loads of world leaders, telling them about the need to create licenses for AI. I think there's probably a bit of cynicism there amongst MPs that, will this create a dominance or increase the dominance of those big players and therefore concentrate economic power even more. I think we can see that in probably some of these results as well. Interestingly, Tories are twice as likely than Labour to be unsure on that question. So they don't know, or a lot of them don't know. And then we asked a few questions about the trust in AI according to different use cases. So we looked at 4 use cases. So we looked at filtering spam or ill-intentioned emails, which we know obviously is employed. It uses AI at the moment. Moderation against harmful content, deciding on credit scores or insurance premiums, and disinformation and proliferation of AI-generated content. So we can see that sort of as we go through those 4 use cases, we go from sort of MPs being relatively comfortable around spam, inattention emails, to being slightly more split, moderation against harmful content, to a little bit more uncomfortable deciding credit scores, insurance premiums, to being fairly uncomfortable around disinformation and proliferation of AI generated content. And we think broadly that this is probably for two reasons. The first is, we go from sort of low stakes to high stakes. So we can see that around filtering spam, that's if you get more spam than what you'd hoped, that's probably not going to be a massive issue. So it's relatively low stakes. Deciding someone's credit score and insurance premium, you can see the stakes there are a bit high. You can see the impact on the individual, through to disinformation and proliferation of AI generated content. Again, slightly more high stakes. However, we think there's also a second reason, and something we want to dig into a bit more with our next round of research, is the impact on MPs themselves and the work that they do in the environment that they're in. Filtering spam, yeah, they can see that in their inboxes. It's probably neither here nor there really. However, disinformation and the proliferation of AI generated content, you can see how that might impact MPs themselves, both in terms of the outcome election, but also the impact on them as people. Will they have a situation where they've been recreated, where AI has been used to generate their voice, to lead to stuff on social media which is apparently them but not them. And I think there was a story yesterday, or perhaps even this morning, of Joe Biden and his voice being cloned by AI and telling Democrats not to go out and vote. As a recent example of that very real impact on politicians. And I think there was also another example a month or two ago, of a politician, I think in Hungary or the Czech Republic, I can't remember which now, but again, where AI had been used to create a fake account, calling for the country not to support Ukraine, and instead to put its support behind Russia instead. And we saw that there was perhaps as a result, but perhaps as a result of other factors as well, a situation where the pro-Russian candidate was favoured. So I think we can see how these things are starting to impact and starting to certainly into the debate, and therefore why MPs might be concerned and demonstrate these kind of concerns. But as mentioned at the outset, we'd really love to dig into why, and that's something we hope to look at in the next round of research. So just pause there very quickly. Any sort of particular questions on any of that so far? If not, happy to jump into the third insight and leave Q&A.
I think we can keep going. Yep.
Yeah, cool. So third insight then, MPs would prefer slow rollout, maximizing the safety of citizens and society. So here I come on to the limitations of our research in a minute, and the limitations of this type of research in a minute, because it's worth bearing in mind with these next couple of slides. But just to sort of present the sort of findings before we get onto that. So half of MPs thought that AI was developing too fast, so 45% compared to 22% who disagreed, and a huge number again, 33%, which we see, as mentioned, reflected throughout this research, didn't know or said neither. Broadly, there were more Conservative MPs who said AI was developing too fast compared to Labour, so 44% compared to 33%. This we found was interesting, given that fewer Conservatives compared to Labour MPs were concerned initially about AI, were more optimistic. So if they're more optimistic and less concerned, why are they arguing for a slowdown? That seemed to be slightly sort of contradictory to us. It may be that it just tends towards that more conservative nature. perhaps. But again, that's a feeling rather than a point of evidence. And so this is something that we want to sort of dig into a bit more. But we felt, given the point in time in which we conducted it, an interesting snapshot of where we are. And you may remember that there was that letter from 300 or so AI experts, including Elon Musk and Geoffrey Hinton and a whole bunch of others, saying that they argued for a 6-month pause in the development of AI, lest it get out of control, which obviously didn't happen, but generated lots of attention at the time, and was one of the reasons why we wanted to ask this question to see where MPs were. And on a similar vein, we asked MPs whether they prioritize safety over growth and innovation, and a vast majority came out and said, safety was more important. As sort of indicated at the outset of this section, there is a slight caveat with these questions in that we, through the shortcomings of the research and limitations around budget, we had to sort of crunch a few things together. So we've created sort of an amalgam of a questionnaire, which isn't ideal, but for us, we felt it provided the snapshot that we wanted to provide, which is where are our MPs on this balance of safety compared to innovation. And we chose this as the contrast because it's something that we've seen politicians, especially Rishi Sunak, mention over and over again, the need to sort of balance safety and innovation, balance growth and safety. And we felt that he was saying it so often, and other MPs within government were saying it so often, but actually, what did other MPs think about this? And broadly, we can see that safety is a top priority compared to growth and innovation. And in terms of how that breaks down according to party lines, so 68% of Labour prioritised safety compared to 53% of Conservatives. So again, slightly contradictory for us, given that more Conservatives wanted a slower rollout compared to Labour. So therefore, why more of them saying safety is a concern for Labour? That's again, that's something that we think there's merit in further research to better understand. And that's the final slide. So that sort of concludes the sort of presentation element and our research to date. As Charles mentioned at the outset, we'd love to hear from others in terms of both what they think about the research, what it tells us, what it doesn't tell us, but more importantly, what I guess people would like to see in the next round of research, because we really want to understand what people in the sector, in the field, think and what they'd love to see in terms of further evidence. So yeah, thanks very
Great.
much.
Thank you very much, James. And we have 10-15 minutes for questions now. And we've got two already in the box, which I think you'd find very interesting to address. And the first is what's going to be the involvement of MPs over the next year in terms of addressing AI policy and responding to it? And what will that split be between the political system and the civil service now that there's a white paper that's been produced? And as you said, the government didn't intend on proposing any legislation in the lifetime of its current term, but obviously the civil servants will live on between governments, and they must have some ideas of their own about where this is going. So maybe address that first.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the first point really to raise there is that Vicat Camrose, who's the minister looking after AI, responsible for AI within the government, said in November, I think maybe early December, that this government won't be bringing forward legislation to look at AI. So from the government's point of view, there won't be really significant involvement on the legislative front, which means that MPs probably won't get too involved in how AI policy in this current government is formed or formulated. There are I guess, a couple of caveats to that. The first is a really obvious one in that at some point this year, there's going to be an election. So that will change everything. Well, it won't change everything. It will change quite a few things, but it will likely change the government. And we probably will see a Labour government if all the polls that we're seeing are right. So that may change the involvement of MPs in AI policy. I guess the obvious follow-up question there is around, so therefore, what are Labour going to do? From what I've heard so far from people in the team and who used to be in sort of Labour's team, I think it's too early to say what their policy response to AI might be. However, I think, and others within the space say to us, that Labour's focus is probably going to be on other areas before it gets to this. So, in short, what involvement are MPs going to have in this debate? Probably not a huge amount over the next year. The sort of second point there is going to be a response to the government's white paper, which it launched in, I think it was the end of March last year. So we saw some of those responses publicly over the summer. So the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Alan Turing Institute, the CMA, and I think others publicly came out with their responses to the white paper. Some of it was quite critical. Some of it was relatively supportive. So in terms of the balance between MPs and civil servants, we're probably going to see much more of a civil servant response to those to that white paper and to the responses that they've had, and it will be navigated certainly within those teams. And then I think the other point to mention is that since the white paper, we've seen the government has announced a number of new bodies. So the Frontier Model Task Force has now changed into the AI Safety Institute, which was sort of officially launched at Bletchley. We've seen other institutes and government bodies in action launch as well in those last few months. So in the main, there is more focus from DCIT and others within that environment, with others and civil servants within that environment, than what there used to be. So if I was thinking about how to influence this debate, I think my focus for the time being would probably be on those civil servants working within those teams, because I imagine most of those people will probably carry over into the new government.
Okay, very good. One of the questions which has come forward, and it sort of dovetails with another one, which is, these issues are, very much high level. They're at the policy level. You've spoken to obviously an elite group of people, but what is the interaction between that and the general population? And is there an element where the concerns of MPs and the concerns of the public will begin to dovetail as deepfakes, the role of false information, and the eroding ability to have trust in the media advances, and how will policymakers and the public respond to a situation in which it becomes more and more difficult for both sides of that equation to manage the message, but also to separate fact from fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a huge issue. I think we can see that there has been some dovetailing already around that issue, around information, disinformation, and misinformation. And I think we can see that with, for instance, the US executive order on AI, which Kamala Harris launched just before the Bletchley AI Safety Summit. And a large part of that a large part of the executive order was focused on information, disinformation, and the need for developers and deployers to start to think about very practical ways that they could challenge that and credibly correct some of that disinformation and misinformation. So I think short answer to the question is, I think those issues are dovetailing already. I think we're already starting to see some action from the US government in particular. I think we can see that also with the EU AI Act, and there is a very sort of very, so I don't know why that keeps happening on my computer, the thumbs down. I must be pressing something without realizing. Apologies. I'm thumbs downing my own answer. And yeah, we can also see some of those conversations, I think, within the EU Act as well, and the importance of information, disinformation. The other bit of context there, I think, which is important, is that we saw what 2 weeks ago, the World Economic Forum say that disinformation and misinformation was its I think top risk in the next 2 years. And I think if we're now seeing those sorts of things to come to the fore, I don't think it's going to take long for these issues to dovetail even more than they are already.
Okay. One thing which comes up is trying to understand what AI is and what AI is not. And I found your responses possibly is the origin of some of the questions that are here, which is that a lot of MPs didn't realize that their Amazon search list is actually AI driven, and they just don't know it. And you mentioned credit scores, and of course, credit scores for a long time were automated, but they weren't artificial intelligence or machine learning informed.
Yeah.
People were okay with that. But now that they attach AI to it, they're not so okay with that. So to what extent is there a way for the general population and also for politicians to sort of get a Janet and John understanding of, well, what is automation, what is machine learning, what is artificial intelligence, and how do they all interact and interplay with one another? And what's the relative speed of their evolution? I mean, we've had automation for a long time, we've accepted it, uh,
Mm.
but AI has sort of sped up what we get used to in terms of changes in our society. So how do we begin to unpack all of those issues, which we don't really realize are going around because it's sort of like a fish in water?
Yeah, yeah. I mean that kind of that broader issue of how do we sort of keep up to date with something that's changing so quickly is one I think all of us struggle with. And from a sort of very very practical point of view, you can only sort of do what you can to read read sort of the latest research or read sort of those sort of foundational books that give you sort of the introduction to the topic. And I saw someone in the chat there has asked about Mustafa Suleiman's book. I've not read it, but nevertheless, I do think reading those sorts of things are useful. However, I'd caveat everything with these people are going to be approaching the subject and what they write from a certain perspective. That perspective isn't necessarily the only perspective, or indeed the one that is most likely to happen. It just happens to be theirs. So I think getting perspectives from lots of different areas I think is useful within this debate. The other thing that I'd sort of add as a sort of piece of context is AI isn't new. It's been around for 70 years or so. There have been various forms of AI, from expert systems through to neural networks, and sort of everything else in between and outside of those. Throughout that sort of 70-year timeline, there have been several sort of AI winters, as they're called, where essentially people have been hyping up the technology, over promising and then under delivering, and therefore AI has gone from being seen as the next big thing to not the next big thing. And that's happened at least sort of 2 or 3 times in the past before. So I think we should approach everything with caution, and with those kind of references and frames in mind. And how much are we going to see the current hype live through into actually being realized, or how much is it going to be again, going into another AI winter? My personal point of view is that I don't think this time round we're going to go into sort of full scale AI winter, because I think we seem to have got to a sort of tipping point where organizations where businesses are deploying AI on a scale that they haven't before. I've seen that with the businesses that I work with. Where, as I mentioned at the outset, they may have been using a bit of AI or machine learning or whatever it might be to answer a certain issue or provide a certain piece of analysis or whatever it is, to now, fully overhauling their products. So it's AI powered and driven from its heart to its external elements. So that feels to me like a tipping point. But also we can't forget that there will be, at this point in time, loads of hype. Some of that will die down. I don't think we'll have the same conversation in a couple of years' time. I think it will change. The other aspect of that is, as anyone sort of worked with technology, and probably quite a few people on this call will know, there's Gartner, which is a tech analyst, produces a hype cycle for different technologies. And this is when sort of at the start of the technology kind of people are getting interested. Then you get to the sort of peak of hype up here, which is probably where we are with sort of Gen AI and other products. And then you get to go through a trough of disillusionment, they call it, where essentially it sort of doesn't live up to the hype, and people don't deploy it. They sort of row back from it, and then gradually it upticks to get to sort of plateau. And I think we're probably at that peak at the moment. So inevitably, we're going to see some of this die away.
Okay. I mean, one of the points which I think is quite interesting to respect to your research is that there's an element of trying to figure out, well, what's the best division of labor between the political system and the civil service. And that essentially, is there an orientation that the civil service has a certain fixture on risk, on growth, on speed, whereas the political system is orientated towards certain things which primary legislation is better designed for, which are sort of broad strokes and sort of guide rails for the system. And, as a result of that, then where really can researchers sort of add to this conversation, realizing that MPs feel themselves to be in a position of being underinformed, incapable of deciding whether or not it's good or bad, but generally feeling, in a sense, ill at ease at the moment about their capacity to sort of deal with it. And I would imagine that their senior civil servants aren't a million miles away from that set of sensations as well.
Yeah, I think that question probably reflects, what we're seeing in the civil side, in civil service, in the government, and in the House of Commons and Parliament more broadly. I think the evidence that sort of demonstrates that is, over the last 6-9 months or so, and sort of crucially before the AI Safety Summit at Bletchley, we saw quite a number of announcements from the government of how it was bringing AI expertise into the civil service, whether it be in the Frontier Model Task Force as it was then, or in other elements of DCIT. And so I think you've got a recognition there that there isn't the expertise, or there hasn't been the expertise to date, and therefore there is a need to bring that expertise into place. And I think they are starting to do that. However, I think the last announcement from the Frontier Model Task Force, its last sort of update, I think they said they now have something like 150 years of experience, or something similar, which it sounds like a good number, but when you actually think about how that sort of breaks down to individuals, you're probably only talking about sort of 10 or 12 individuals, right? And they probably know more. So compared to the wealth of insights that researchers in this space will be developing, will be able to develop through future work research, I think there is still a very clear need for researchers to be engaging with those civil service focused bodies. And I think that's probably where I would put my attention at this point in time. If the sort of motivation is to inform the debate rather than influence necessarily the debate in a certain direction. In terms of the split of work, So DCIT has a central, I forget the name of the body, but it has a central AI risk team, which is there just to look at the risks of the technology. Um, and I think you can see from that sort of point of view that if you are a researcher looking at risks, then I would engage with that team because that's probably where it's going to be the most valuable. Um, if you're looking at those sort of wider risks, the wider societal risks, it's probably important to inform MPs of what you're doing and how it might impact their constituents. But are they going to be people that will be using your research, be able to take that and actually, change things to inform the debate, to inform, all these all the different announcements that may happen? Probably not at this point in time. So I guess my approach would be specific according to the type of risk that you're looking at, and therefore the type of team within DCIT that's looking at those things.
Okay, very good. And I know that we have a question here which sort of relates to the question of really the role of AI in the education space and its ability to sort of transmit norms and ethics through its decision-making processes and generative AI has sort of highlighted some of those questions, and it will be, this will be our wrap-up question for the session. But is there an element that a large part of the conversation we've talked about with AI has related to commercial activities, to employment impacts? I know when I speak to lawyers, most especially those on the bench, that the question of the role of AI in decisions such as on the bench is something which they're quite interested in but also afraid of, and that will there be a wider set of things which we'll need to develop in order to say, well, there are certain aspects of human behavior in education, in law and justice that we probably will leave the AI tools at the door, because we don't necessarily, if we're going to make a bad decision, we need the bad decision to be entirely human and not computer informed. So to what extent do you think these issues will arise as a question for MPs? Because at the moment, most of your queries related to that operational end of when MPs are talking, but obviously if they get talking about constitutional matters,
Mm.
MPs can sort of really weigh in quite heavily on those things about, well, what constitutes ethical, just behavior and norms.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a really important point and a great question. I think there are probably a few things on that. I think the first is that if if there is if we still have a situation where we can't explain what or how AI has reached a decision, then I think there is probably quite a clear sort of ethical and moral element which or argument which says that we can't be using AI to make a decision on whatever it might be, especially where it affects someone in an important way. And I think I'm right in saying that the EU AI Act has made that distinction in its risk profiling of AI, and I think it has said, I forget the exact terminology it uses, but it's where there is a material impact on someone. There must be human oversight, and we must be able to explain what the answer is, and we must be able to have redress. That consumer person, whoever it might be, needs to have redress to that decision. So I think you can see that they are starting to think about those issues. And I think that probably will need to come to the fore a lot more if we see AI rolled out in education and justice or whatever. Personally, I think there is a big concern there. There was a case quite a few years ago now, but in the US, which used an algorithm to decide bail sentences. And I think it was ProPublica who did some investigations into this. I think the system was called Compass. and it found that there was sort of bias and discrimination within the algorithm, and so it was essentially giving certain segments of society harsher bail requirements than others. And obviously that's, that's not what you want from your system, but it's because it's been, based on the data that it has so far, and so it's been therefore it's therefore ended up in that place. So, we can see how instances of this sort of stuff have gone wrong. Even if we look at the Horizon scandal, and that's not necessarily AI, but the computer there was people said the computer couldn't be wrong, and yet it clearly was wrong. It led to a huge amount of grief and upset and false convictions. So there, I think there is a very clear sort of moral and ethical need to understand what's going on, what leads to a decision, if we can explain that decision or not, and if people have redress. And I think that redress point is probably got to be one of the most critical elements, because if someone can't challenge a decision made by AI, then how do we ever know it's the right one?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point for us to conclude. As always, these webinars have been recorded, so you can go back and watch the webinar again and find out more. We again, we have the Policy Fellowship Program in AI. Please look into it in further detail, and Andy Dunn in our office will be happy to hear from you. And it just falls to me to thank again James Boyd-Wallis for a very interesting and engaging presentation, and some thought-provoking responses to the questions we've had here today. And please look at the IPR YouTube channel, our social media channels, and the University of Bath website to find out more about what we do at the IPR, some of the research that we are engaged with, and also the AI and machine learning research group in the Department of Computer Science. So with that, I wish you a good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.